Good evening, everybody. For those who have never met me before, my name is Sister Majella McCarron. I'm a native of West Fermanagh, but I didn't ever think I would be called to help to defend it like this. I worked as a missionary in Nigeria for 30 years, from 64 to 94. And the last 2 years of that, I worked with the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people for 2 years. And because of that very slight engagement, I was advised not to return, so I had to give up my life there. And I was just saying to Nemo Bassey, 16th of August 1994, just 2 days ago, 19 years ago, I left Nigeria. However, Nigeria never left me. So I want particularly to thank Friends of the Earth for this invitation. It's very special for me because I want to just honour Nemo Bassey. I knew him slightly in Nigeria, and I was like this at the beginning of understanding how campaigns work. And because we had very concerned and committed journalists in some of the Nigerian media, I was made very aware of who the activists were in the field when I was beginning to understand what the oil and gas issue was about. And I remember making great efforts to invite him and his friend Oronta Douglas to please come and talk to my small group of missionaries in a hall like this in Benin City in Nigeria. And I had to recap with him because I knew it was a very critical day for him as well, because he had just completed 4 months underground and 6 weeks in detention, and he was on his way back to his home when he and Oronto came in and talked very briefly. And I remember Oronto lifting his shirt to show us some of the physical marks that they had endured in detention. I didn't ever think, I went back for a visit 11 years ago. I met Nemo very briefly that time and was very inspired by his continued commitment. But I also want to remember something else. I was back in Ireland about a year, and I was working in the Irish Missionary Union as their justice officer, when a very big, battered brown envelope arrived. And when I opened it, it was an inscribed book of Nemo Bassey's poetry, which he had posted in Nigeria, and over several weeks it had managed. And if I had come from my office here today, I came from my home, I would have brought it to show you that it's one of my treasured possessions. But not to be outdone by that, just after I met him, he handed me another book of his poetry, published in 2011, and I think my input will conclude with one of his collection. I offered to speak a little bit on the campaigning exercise itself because it's a pretty hazardous, horrendous experience. There is nothing easy or simple about it. And one of the little phrases that I would hope we would remember is integrity of intention. I think Eddie spoke very well about his vision for Love Leitrim, and having the vision, and I think Nemo mentioned that too, knowing what you're about, knowing what the end scenario is, what the preferred scenario is for the people, that has to be written down, it has to be formalised, it has to be shared with the public. And I suppose one of the great contributions of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people is that it developed its Ogoni Bill of Rights. Whether you like this group or like that group, ask any Ogoni and he will never or she will never disagree with what is in the Ogoni Bill of Rights. So sometimes you can have a multiplicity of groups working on an issue. They need a guiding document, a guiding statement. And I would say the same is true of Shell to Sea. If you go onto the website and you scroll down, there are 3 objectives there. So whether I'm working in Newfoundland or in America, if I support Shell to Sea, if I support the Ogoni people, I know what I'm supporting. I measure my support against the objectives that are properly expressed. So that is one, and it's a responsibility for every activist, every campaigner, every supporter to inform oneself of that vision statement and to regularly review one's own behaviour in a group against what the expectation of the impacted community is, because the impacted community is central to everything that we campaigners do. And not only that, we have other assistant documents. For example, I would have worked a lot on policing of protest in Eris. So I would depend a lot on the European document on human rights, particularly as it pertains to protest and the various liberties that as Europeans we have a right to. The same thing with the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the various treaties that Ireland has signed up to. These are my guiding documents, and they're my right. I don't have to apologise for them or to bow down. They are my rights. They have been agreed by the great big communities that we are all part of it. Now, as regards the campaign response, well, I want to tell you another little story. To inform that vision statement, you have to get pretty good at analysis, at least a few key people in every group, and talk about complexity. I don't know where Oisín is now, but Oisín and I worked in a campaign years ago. And I remember the 40 to 60 hours about 8 of us spent formulating about 10 sentences. There were so many different opinions in the group. We all had a very different view of what we were attempting. We all had a different interpretation of the situation. A Syrian nun, quite like myself, arrived in Ireland last week, and she was interviewed by Patsy McGarry in the Irish Times last Monday. And she said she had come to meet the Archbishop's Conference to advocate for the facts in relation to Syria and the conflict in Syria. And of course I got the shock of my life. She said, I didn't come to support the Assad regime, but we as Christians would be happy with a reform of the Assad regime. We're terrified of the rebels because our future as a 10% Christian group is so threatened. And I just said to myself, my goodness, I would have to spend a year studying and making an analysis of the Syrian situation. There are so many elements that we have to take cognizance of.